to the Pottery Student Podcast. I am Rachelle Eason, owner of Marvelous Mud Pottery Studio here in lovely Lakeland, Florida. And my fabulous instructor, Diana Harrison, is here with us as well.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Rachelle.
Hi, Diana. It's always lovely to see you in a podcast.
Yes, you too. Last time we recorded, we were on Zoom, I think, or on FaceTime.
Yeah, it was just,
it's nice.
Yeah, the podcast is nice. We talk all the time, obviously, but it is nice to have kind of that comfort level too before we start our discussion for whatever the topic of the day is. And so today's topic is
storytelling with clay. Yes, storytelling with clay.
Storytelling with clay. And that came about because our next sculpture workshop, which is coming up in March. And I know that March is still a ways away, but our sculpture workshops sell out like crazy within a couple weeks. And so I just opened the registration for it, and it is open right now just to our members. But the next topic of our sculpture workshop is human story sculptures. So very excited about that.
Everybody's already talking about it.
Yeah, it's really excited.
What stories you might tell.
Yes, what stories we might tell. And so the thing about sculpture is that, like, we did human goddesses and gods last year. I think we did the mythical gods, goddesses, warrior kind of thing. And that was last March. And then in the fall, we did September, I think. It was whimsy, wild or real animal sculptures. And then we're adding actually another sculpture workshop to our annual endeavors. And that's a nature sculpture. And that's going to happen in the summertime now. But the interesting thing about the human sculpture that we do in the spring each year, I usually have it on the calendar scheduled around the International Women's Day. Even though we have men that participate, it's not about women. It doesn't have to be about women. It can be about anybody, but I usually do have it scheduled around that time just because I like that extra feel of empowerment that women have when they're embracing a human sculpture with that background that it's International Women's Day. And this year I call it Human Story. And so this is just a 2-day workshop. So we actually don't get into what I would teach in a 5-day workshop, say. In a 5-day workshop, we're going to learn about bone structure and muscular structure and all of those parts of anatomy that help us to make a figure that's more realistic, or it can still be whimsical, but you start with the real. The Human Story is a 2-day workshop that we're doing in March, and it's just a little different than what we've done before. Do you have any ideas of what you're thinking like your human story would be about, or how we're going about that?
Oh, I've got 2 or 3 ideas right now, but time will tell what's actually going to happen.
Yeah.
But right now I've got a couple ideas. One is more of a family story, because a lot of the sculpts I've been doing have been individual personal stories for myself. So I'm thinking about incorporating more of my family in there, my husband and possibly my dog.
I love that.
But then there's also always that pull to tell my story.
Yeah.
So right now, we'll see which one happens first. Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing, because as soon as I added story to the title, some of our regular sculpture or sculpting students were thrown off a little bit, because they're like, how do I tell a story? What am I doing that makes this a story? And they were thinking more literally, like, how is this 3D sculpt that I'm going to do actually going to portray the story to my audience? And I look at a story sculpture as more about the artist who's creating it, and the stories or the expressions that we're feeling that we can portray through our sculpt. So I feel like every sculpt that we've done is a story. It's all been inspired somewhere, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking it's almost impossible to keep your story out of your clay.
Exactly. You're exactly right. And it's such a personal connection. And I think one reason why I titled this one to be the human story is that I wanted people to think more prior to actually coming to class. That's my big deal, right? Because when you come into class, I want you to all of these feelings and inspirations and ideas and all that I'm hoping that they're already stewing around in your mind. And I send out several prep emails prior to the sculpting workshops, and they're step by step. It's actually one of the very few things that I do in increments, because you know me, I want to tell everybody everything at one time. But we start out with one email that kind of gets you thinking and percolating and being more observant to things that might happen in your daily life or around you, and start making notes. And then there's another email that comes out that says, okay, let's start to refine this idea a little bit, give it some definition, and then so on and so forth. And so each prep stage helps us to basically have, as I like to call it, like this stew that's in your mind. All of these things have been thrown in there, and now you're stirring it and you're getting it to come up for flavor.
Yeah. Are you sending us those emails as that process is happening for you?
Not usually. Not usually, of course. So I usually have already accomplished that process. And each time I teach, I could be teaching the same technique over and over again, even with the same project, but each time I teach it, I'm going to teach it differently. And so I've already gone through this process of my story that I'm going to be sharing. And I already have a few things in my pot that I'm stirring around, and I've already been inspired by what that story is. And I look at that story as a metaphor for what you're creating. And so when I am working my process, I take mental notes. It would be really smart if I took physical notes, but I take mental notes about what stage before my stew is being cooked are these things happening, how long it took me to go through that process, and where I grabbed that inspiration from. And then in my usual way, I times that by 3 or 4. And so I know if it took me just a few days to get there, that I need to allow a few weeks for students, not because students are slower, but because they're not used to this process. So there's a comfort level that happens with sculpting, because sculpting is already, just the word sculpting throws people off.
And then you have the word human in, and that becomes, then you can see our faces all change, and we're like, we have to make it look human. But it doesn't have to look human.
No, it doesn't have to look human, and it can still be whimsical, and it can be abstract, and it can be a combination. It can be an eclectic look. It actually could be the parts of an environment that you want to make that maybe you're in, and that's your human story. The actual human isn't even in there. It's just these parts that come together to tell this story. And the idea with the human story, we're at this point, as you're talking about sending out information, we're starting to take the registrations from our previous sculpture students, and then our members, if there's any spots left, our regular membership will be invited, and there won't be any spots left after that because we sell these out every time. But people are still looking at this as a literal figure telling the story. So for example, if you want to tell the story of your love for flowers and garden or growing them, succulents, okay, something like that, people are still on the idea that it has to be a gardener or a person planting succulents or holding a succulent. Whereas you could turn it really abstract and whimsical, and you might have a succulent growing that gives the impression of the human figure. Or there might be something else, a different shape that you're doing, and there might be prickly texture, and that's the reference to it. It's very much a metaphor for the story. But my intention is to go beyond you just loving succulents.
Yeah.
My intention is finding the symbolism and your connection between those aspects of your story.
And I use a lot of symbolism in my sculpts and in my art and my journaling. We've done that a lot, so with you and I. And that symbolism, I think part of it, the intimidation factor, is some people think that somebody's going to look at your sculpture and see like straight into your soul. They may, but they may not. You can put hidden things in there for yourself. So you get to almost control the level of vulnerability that you are showing somebody, but the full vulnerability may be included in the sculpt, but you've done hidden things.
Exactly.
For journaling, pockets.
But that's still a tangible, it's still a tangible thing that you're talking about. And that's great. But I'm even talking about going even further into that, because you don't have to have the literal view into your soul.
Yes.
You can have that metaphor, that something standing for it. And the idea is that you are, as the sculptor, as the artist, you're unearthing these aspects of that story, and those aspects are guiding you to what you're creating. And you might be thinking about, so human story, for example, my next one. Oh, let me go back to my last one, actually. So the last one we did was, I did Athena, is what I was talking about, the strong Greek goddess. And I based that on actually my first year as the owner of Marvelous Mud. We just started Marvelous Mud in 2022. And although I've been teaching for so many years, 30 plus years, and I had my own studio prior to this, a commercial studio, this studio was set up so differently. And I really felt the empowerment and the strength as to not necessarily what I personally was doing, but what we were doing as a whole in helping our members and our students, and the strength that came through that empowerment. And I really wanted to embrace that. And I ended up doing this warrior figure, and I have pictures of her, but she's actually glazed already. Surprise. But I ended up doing this warrior figure that is holding, instead of holding a, what would that be? A sword or whatever it is. She's holding a paintbrush, and I can't think of the word. What blocks the thing that a warrior carries? The shield? The shield. I couldn't think of it. Remember, I had brain surgery. I'm gonna tuck that in there. I had brain surgery. I'm still having trouble grasping words. But the shield is a paint palette. And then her kind of, you know how warriors have this long cross sash in front of them, and sometimes they have their weapons in there or something like that. Mine had leaves. And the leaves were this vine growing around her, which was actually in reference to my ankle and leg tattoo that I had just gotten prior to that. And then there's an owl sitting on her shoulder. And so there's all these parts to it. And if you were to look at her, you may not think of her as Athena, but you definitely would think of her as strength in art and creativity and my story coming out. And honestly, whether or not the audience gets that or not isn't my purpose. But when I look at her, I feel like I had so much come out of me into her. And you said the word vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an important aspect of giving ourselves to our sculpture.
Yes.
And not holding back.
Yes, and it is, and I feel like it's a journey, and I don't know, and I'm sure many artists go through this, but there's a level of starting to put your work out there, showing other people, which is good in this community because we get to show our fellow members all the time our work, so that kind of helps with that. But you're showing your work, and there's times when it feels like technically you're showing your work, meaning the quality of and the technicality of your clay skills. And then there's another layer of vulnerability when you start sharing your story.
Yeah.
And the importance of artists sharing their story is endless.
Right.
It's just part of the universe. It's part of humanity. But as you're stepping out and doing that is such a beautiful thing. It's scary sometimes, but it's beautiful. And so I'm very excited to see how this resonates and translates with our members, because now they got the animal sculpt under their belts. We do some sculpting in class for getting more comfortable. And then taking it to another level with the storytelling, how they're going to connect with that.
Yeah, I'm excited to find out. And I'm also excited to go through this process with them and really guide them through it, because it is something that's pretty foreign. And I can really just start to tell about my process. And so my human story is based on my new grandbaby who's due in January. And so I have a granddaughter who is 2.5, Willow, and she has a little brother being born in January. His name is Walker. And so interesting thing is how this has already evolved in my head just in the last few weeks. And so as I started thinking about, I felt really strongly that was my human story that I wanted to share. And that came about because we were talking to Willow one day about, she has this little chair at my house, this little peacock chair that's a little rocker. And she came over and she sat in it, and I was like, and that she likes to read her books and that and all that. And I said, so are we going to need to get Walker his own little animal rocker? That's hard to say. And Willow said she was going to share. And she was excited about sharing things with Walker. Now, remember, she's 2 and he's not born yet, so we don't know if that's actually going to happen. But that started me thinking about the relationship that she's already starting to build with her brother, who's not even here yet. Yeah. And I really love that as a human story. And as I was going through, and I thought, yeah, we could be literal, and I could have a sculpt of her with the baby and either holding the baby, reading to the baby, something like that, sitting together, something like that. Or I could then take it to the next level. And one of the things is I was thinking more abstract, and I started seeing them later on as they grew. And one of the things that Willow loves is she's still sitting on the little toddler swing with the straps in and everything, and she loves to be pushed from the front. And I thought, well, that's something that she's probably going to do with Walker when it's his turn. And so I started from them as when he's first born to their early relationship, and I started thinking about that. And then something struck me. We went somewhere. I was with them, and we went somewhere, and I was looking for a picture to share with, I think it was one of my friends, and I really don't have that many pictures of me with anybody, honestly, because I'm the one always taking the pictures. And that was something that happened when my kids were little. I wasn't in the picture very much, or even when I'm with my husband or something like that. And so we were in Spartanburg. That's where we were. And I specifically had a picture taken with Chris, my husband, and Willow with us. And I thought, what if I start looking at this human story? Because again, it's my expression. But instead of me being the outsider, looking at them and watching their relationship, what if I included myself in that relationship and how I foresee that tie? Or even if it's my husband, and I'm still not talking literal 3 figures, but that's where I am right now, is how would I come together to represent that? And years ago, it was representing my family and our four kids who are now all grown adults. But at the top of the garden tower are my 4 children as owls, as little baby owlets, and they're sitting in a nest. And then lower down the garden tower is the big mama owl. So that, of course, is me supporting my children, my baby owls in their nest. Yes. And I ran out of a way to incorporate my husband, who's obviously very important. It was the size that I did. Remember, when I do things, they evolve. And so as I was planning this garden tower, it was evolving, and I wasn't quite sure how I was going to incorporate him. And my daughter-in-law, actually, it was her sister-in-law that I was telling this to, and she said, well, what if you had an owl figure that was hanging from the side of the house or from the soffit or something behind the whole garden tower with his wings outstretched as if he was protecting the garden tower, protecting the brood, his children and his wife on there, or all of us together. I'm on the bottom anchoring it and him at the top. And I love that So the idea of having this story evolve with our grandchildren and maybe both of my husband and I in it, or myself in it, or even our son and daughter-in-law, somehow making that story grow and grow. And I was starting to think, because I go down in the deep end, because then I'm like, oh, maybe this sculpture is part of a bigger story. And I keep adding to that story as we go. But when you were talking about incorporating the family, that's what I got to, was this garden tower idea. Because my daughter, my second daughter, Renee, years ago made a tabletop garden tower. And she picked an animal. We each had kind of animals that represented us, the symbolism of them. And she sculpted those animals. And Chris, the dad, was the Papa Bear at the bottom. And each child was stacked until we got to the top, and there I was as an owl again, as the mama owl, the wise owl. But that's what I think of too, is that there's symbolism, and yet there's something tangible that people can connect to. They know what an animal looks like, and they get the symbolism from it. So it's not necessarily abstract, but it's more the metaphor for that story. And so it's like a family stack.
Yeah.
And so I think that's neat too.
Yeah, and that's why I think like the symbolism, like I use it so much, because if somebody comes and sees, you post your picture online, or you see it, or you show it, or wherever it manifests itself into, some people are going to pick up on the importance and the significance of the owl, people that know you, people that resonate with the owls themselves, people that see the family and see it like that. And other people are going to be like, oh, that's really cool.
Right. Right, yeah. Yeah.
But you got me thinking, because I still feel like I have a lot of my own story to tell. But one of the things I'm thinking about is how my husband keeps me so grounded. Like coming home to him, the dog each night, gets my happy place. Most just to have my heart is happy, I'm relaxed, I'm peaceful. And trying to somehow represent that without just some
right
together.
Right.
Yeah. And it's also a valid interpretation of it, but I feel like I want that some sort of symbolism to get somewhere else with it.
And I think that's so important, and that you're working through that, and that you understand that they're part of that story that you really want to share, and especially this path that you're on life right now, and it's transitioning from what you had before. And I think one of the things that we, especially as women, do is we leave ourselves out of the focus. We leave ourselves out of the visual, out of the camera. And even though we did the goddess sculptures last spring, and it was supposed to be something that we felt that connection to, and it was, everybody who did something here, they came out. It was like you just unzipped them and looked inside, and there were their pieces. It was amazing. It was an amazing workshop, which I think sculpture workshops are always that. It was truly special. But I think the fact that this whole concept of the human story invites you to be part of that, and that you have to really think about how you want to interpret your inclusion in what you're creating. So it's not just about the symbolism or the idea of the story you want to tell. To me, it's about figuring out how you can, and I love the idea of the symbolism, and this has truly not much to do with sculpture, but it's something that I always go back to as my kind of reference. So years ago, I saw this drawing by somebody, and it was talking about the difference between sympathy and empathy.
Yeah.
And I know I've done this and talked about this in art journaling, but it was a hole, like somebody had fallen into a hole in the ground. And this person was down at the bottom in this hole. And there was somebody at the top of the hole leaning over and saying, hey, you okay down there? Oh, I'm sorry you're down there. That kind of thing. And what do you need kind of thing, right? Okay, and so that's the idea of sympathy. And empathy is the other person that's down at the bottom with the one who fell in. And they're not saying, how can I help? Or what do you need? They are simply saying, I am here. I understand. Whenever you're ready, that kind of thing. And so there was a difference. And I think of these human stories as that same thing. Your story doesn't have to be so obvious that somebody at the top of the hole can see you at the bottom and they can sympathize. But your story can be more that sitting next to the thing that you're trying to tell, the story that you're trying to tell. And the feeling is just then shared. And that's what these human stories are. They're shared. I don't know. It's shared humanity is what it is. And so I'm really excited about that.
Yeah.
How we're going to pull that out from everybody, I don't know. But I'm always like that before I do a human sculpture. Or before I do any kind of sculpture, I'm always, okay, little secret. It is one of the things that I absolutely love to teach. And it's also one of the things that scares me like crazy before I teach it, because it is so open-ended. But my job is to pull out from people what they don't want to let go. That's the key.
Yeah.
And so I'm always, the night before, I never sleep. Days before, I'm making notes. I know the one thing about this being all members, I love it because I've already gotten to know everybody. And so I write little notes about them. I am very observant to what they're saying about their own work and about what they're saying about themselves in weeks prior to the sculpting class. And I really, part of my prep, besides prepping you guys, part of my prep is prepping the language and the actions and the inspiration that I can provide for each of my students so that they have a very individual journey, an expressive journey, and one that, yes, pushes them to the edge and they may get a little frustrated, but that's where the growth happens. If you're in your comfort zone, that's not going to. You can easily do a man, a woman, and a dog and a succulent sitting beside you and call it done. But that's not what you're going to do. You're going to have so much more feeling. Even if it is a man and a woman and a dog sitting together, it's going to come out with so much more feeling and expression because of the details that you put in there and how they're positioned, how they're looking at each other. Are they looking at each other? Are their heads together? Are they petting the dog? Is the dog laying beside them? So the human story is expressed through art in the individual little details that occur. And paying attention to those details is what tells that story.
Yeah. And that's what I love about you as I'll just waiting for a little bit. I'm trying to get off on that tangent right now.
Thank you.
Specifically about the way you teach clay, sculptural clay, is that if I did come to you and I said I want to do a man, a woman, and a dog, you're going to tell me, okay, and then what else are you going to do?
Yeah. And now you know you can't do a man, a woman, and a dog because we've talked about this all time. No, I'm just kidding. No. Yeah. And I'll be like, okay, that's a good start. Now, where's it going? You know, because that's not the sculpt.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And I do throw people off when they come to me, they say things like that. But if I just said, oh, that's great. Let's see what no, because you're going to evolve through it. But if you're not challenged, if you're not pushed out of your comfort zone, you will not come up with a sculpture. You'll come up with something that you like. You'll say, oh, yeah, it's nice. I like this. But it is not going to be what you truly know was inside of you.
Right.
You have to be, there's a navigation to my job without intruding. And there's an evolution and a movement of translation in when you're doing that really doesn't have any limits on it. We're not in a box.
No, we're not.
Yeah.
And when you said that, I got the memory came to me of, you may have heard this, in the 6-word stories, what writers can do with 6 words.
Yeah.
I love that, but it made me think sometimes no simple line drawing tells
Right.
the story. And then it's just, but I think you said it, it's the expression of it.
Right.
Something to get it to resonate. And I think that's where that vulnerability comes in. Yes, I can come in and I could make a man, a woman, and a dog. And if anybody that's made a man, woman, and dog,
not picking on this.
No, right.
The context of the story that I'm contemplating, one of the stories I'm contemplating telling. But for me, it would be out of what you've seen me do in the evolution of my art. You would know immediately.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And
It's the authenticity of the story. Talking to a couple of our members about this, there's stories that I want them to tell because I want to know more. They've mentioned it, they touched on it, it's come up in conversations, and I want to hear or see the rest of the story. So I'm so curious about how it's going to evolve. But yeah, you're right. It's in that, how am I telling my individual story, however I choose to represent the man, the woman, and the dog, and then how does that connect with our shared humanity?
Right. And most of that will not occur until you're in the moment.
Yes.
And so that's one of the things I do have you sketch out things, and some people have gotten so detailed, like how low the eyelids go. I talk about eyelids and how they change the expression or the mood, and or how the hair is going to be and all that. And honestly, that's great to sketch it. But when somebody comes in with such a detailed sketch, I'm like, that's fabulous. You've looked at it. Now close it and put it away. That's not what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And they're like, what? No, that's not what you're going to do. You did just spend all that time sketching it. So now you feel it.
Yes.
Now it's that feeling. It's not, that's why I tend to not invite our students to look on certain websites or certain social media groups or all that for ideas, because then in my experience, people, potters, ceramic artists, or other artists, students, think that it needs to look exactly like that. It's never going to look exactly like that because that was a different person who created it. And the idea that you want your figure or your sculpt to look exactly like what you sketched, even though you sketched it, it was a different person that sketched that because you grew through that sketch. And as long as you don't limit yourself to still going back and recreating what you sketched because you're so stuck that it has to look like this, you need to feel the growth that you went through just by creating that sketch. Every single time you're inspired, you grow. Every single time you touch clay, you grow. Everything is a growth experience. I'm not the same person right now that I was 35 minutes ago when we were struggling to get all of this podcast stuff set up. I'm much more confident in my setup for my podcast. But honestly, we grow through every aspect. And I think that's one of the beauties of even just a 2-day sculpture class that we're doing, is that you are growing from the minute you start to the minute.
Growing from the second you say we're going to do sculpture class and you start thinking.
Right. Exactly. You really do. And then we do that glaze day that's 8-9 weeks later. And many of our members continue to work on their sculpts for days after the sculpting workshop is actually over. And of course I help and assist and all that. But they have ideas how they're going to glaze it. But then through the evolution of building it, that changes. And then when glaze day comes, they look at their piece bisque fired, if it was dried and bisque fired by them, and they get a different feel. So it comes out differently. The thing that I love is that you can plan and prep and all those kinds of things. You're really not prepping. You're prepping the ingredients that are going into the stew, but you really aren't seasoning it until you start to evolve through it. And it's that seasoning that really helps to express yourself through it. So I love that. I think that's one of the most amazing things about our sculpture workshops.
Yeah. I want to sidetrack though. We've been talking a lot about the inspiration. I want to talk about some of the intimidation.
Okay.
When you call it a human workshop, I think we mentioned this earlier. Some people their hearts sinks and they go, "Oh, I can't make a face," or "Oh, I don't want to do this."
Right.
The one thing I noticed with the sculpture workshop, I was doing the Phoenix, and I
did look on specific websites, but it wasn't what I wanted. What I ended up looking, because what I realized was I wanted it to look somewhat bird-like. So I actually looked up pterodactyl skeletons and drawings. And what I realized was the most important thing to me was there's a curvature that happens between the neck and the wing. And there's angle out. And I was like, in my mind, I was like, that to me was the most important part because that's where the spread happens.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I'm looking for. The rise.
Right.
Is in that gesture.
So, but I bring this up because the thing I've learned from drawing, sketching, pottery is it does not take as much as people think to make it look like the thing that you want it to be.
Because, yes, so you're talking like there's technical aspects.
Yes.
And there's anatomy, and there's...
That can be intimidating.
It can be very intimidating. Then there's the physics, because wings... If they're going to fly, they have to go a certain way because of cutting through the air or whatever. If they're going to molt, and then there's physics to it too, or the idea of physics in a mystical creature. But all of it can be very intimidating. But what I have found, and again, if we were doing a longer workshop, we would study all of that before we actually did our build. But we're not doing a longer workshop. We're doing a 2-day build. Even though people take longer after that for detail, we're trying to get as much done in 2 days. And so what I have found by the prep of asking people to look at pictures, real photographs, if it's a real thing, or drawing your other 2-dimensional art of a mystical creature, something like that, or drawings, or a lot of times what I tell people to look at are tattoos or henna.
Yes.
Because those will get the lines where they need to go to help to understand that maybe there's motion involved, there's flight involved, there's molting involved, whatever it is. But what I ask them to not do is to go look at other 3D sculptures. And they really don't like that. In fact, with the animal workshop, I have people get a stuffed animal of the animal that they choose, and preferably a floppy one, because then they can take that stuffed animal and they can reposition and they can do that kind of thing. And so when you're talking intimidation, how can you be intimidated when your sculpture teacher is telling you to get a stuffed animal? Yeah, it's a great excuse to get a new fuzzy, lovey thing. And honestly, I try to approach it differently. And because you're not in it to, again, put your piece in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You're not there to go to the Smithsonian. That'd be great. But
just for the record, you guys are listening, it happens.
Yes, that's fantastic. The idea, I'm really more about the growth experience and the individual expression through that. And so when we approach, we do talk, especially in the human sculpture, and I made sure I called this a human story, because we just did an animal sculpt. And I think animals are actually a little bit more difficult than humans in multiple ways. But I think that people have this idea of what a rabbit looks like, or a fox looks like, or a monkey, or whatever it is, or even a dragon as a mystical creature, or a phoenix, right? But with a human, we understand that we're all human, but we all have these different attributes that make us look different from each other. And so you can identify a human, but it's a little different than having to like key into a certain animal. And so when we start to look at sculpting the face or sculpting the body or anything like that, I do go back to 2D drawing when I was teaching figure drawing. And we go back to when I had people use beans and how the beans connect, and where the joints are is where the beans curve a little bit, or they turn or whatever. And we do talk about how arms move and how legs move, and what would if you wanted a running sculpture, what would be the position of it. But we don't get so tied into the muscular structure of it as we would if we were making a realistic, more in-depth sculpture. And so I try to take the intimidation out by having them look at some things that possibly are not maybe as realistic as looking at a realistic sculpture. Like, you don't want to go look at the sculpture of David, because that's not what you're doing. You know, we're not doing a Grecian god that is anatomically correct and huge, whatever, and lasts for centuries. We are creating a piece, though, that does last for a while. So in 100 years, when your piece is found, they can learn about you. But so we're taking, I hope that I'm taking the intimidation factor away, or at least reducing it, by talking through the stories with the people that are coming in to do this workshop, because it's not about the human figure, which is crazy for me to say as I'm teaching a human figure sculpture class, but it's about the story. And we have seen, if people spend more time thinking about the story and get inspired by the aspects that make that story so real. Are you feeling the outdoors? Are you feeling nature? Are you feeling that you're closed up and shy? And I've had people do a human sculpture before that their story was that they felt trapped, and I had one who did years ago when I was teaching college class. And they literally made a box. This was a human story. And the lid was offset a little bit, and there was a hand, and you could only see the top of the head. That's all you saw. And that was a human story. But on the outside was like a graffiti. The box was done with graffiti, and it had symbols and words and all those that came out. It was very expressive. It was very powerful. And you could look at that and know what that artist was feeling. So I hope to reduce that intimidation by, again, concentrating more on the story and how to tell that story, how to share that story. It's not a narration, not a narrative story. It's almost like a mime in clay. You're showing with a visual rather than telling. And I hope that as we work through those aspects, that our students are not intimidated, or at least not as much.
Yeah, it's like you have to set aside the intimidation. You have to set aside the intimidation to allow yourself to be uncomfortable to get to the vulnerability.
Exactly, you really do. That's exactly right. And that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, it's very hard.
Yes.
It's easy for me to sit here and say.
And most people don't come in with that. But through the day, even through day one, they get comfortable with it. They start to realize that no one's judging their sculptural technique against the person beside them or somebody else. They're not being judged at all. They're being invited to share their story. And I never call it a show and tell. I call it a show and share or something like that. I can't remember what I have said in the past, but yeah, I have that. My brain, but yeah, it's exciting. I'm really looking forward. I'm always looking forward to sculpture class. It's one of my favorite things ever. So I'm excited. And March isn't that far away. No. So if you're one of our members and you are watching this, I hope you are on our registration list already. So we had that in September, and it was sold out since April, end of March, early April. And so they get first dibs. And if there's any spots left, we open it to the other members. And then again, if there's any spots left, we open it to the public, but we've never opened it to the public. All of our sculpture workshops have always been sold out. So anyways, so we're excited for it. And you can find out information. If you're a member, you're going to find out that information through our member emails and our communities on the dashboard that we have, our membership portal. But I do actually have it, I believe, on our website. So if you go to marvelousmudpotterystudio.com/pottery classes, the information for the Human Story Sculpt is on there. It just does not give you a registration link. It gives you a link to email me that you're interested. And so if I ever expand and do more than one section or whatever, then we'll have you on the list if you're interested. But before we cut out today, I want to draw attention to the mugs that we're both using. These were thrown and altered and glazed by our very own Leo Arbonis. And gosh, Leo, I've been saying your last name wrong, right? I've been pronouncing that wrong for the last 2 years that I've known him. Perfect for me, right? Anyway, Leo made these for us, and they're perfectly fitting our hands trends and our styles, and we are just so happy to be using a Leo original.
That's so exciting.
I know, so love it. And Leo teaches our throwing membership once a week on Thursday nights, and he also teaches our throwing leagues, which is once a month. And again, those are all for members of our studio. So if you want to become a member of our studio, you need to take a 4-week class, which we call Dig Deep. That class is taught by Diana. And then we issue invitations based on the dynamics of what's going on with our membership, if we have space, and also if you play nicely with others. So we like to have a membership, that community that is very strong, but also very friendly to each other. And it's just a great situation. But thank you for watching us today. Is there anything else you want to add, Diana?
Thank you. That was a great conversation. I really love having you, and I hope everybody else enjoys it as much as I do.
Thank you. I enjoyed that too. All right. Thank you. Again, visit our website, marvelousmudpotterystudio.com. This is Rachelle with Marvelous Mud Pottery Studio in lovely Lakeland, Florida. Come visit us.